everybody, and thank you very much for coming. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to ISSI. And before we begin today's talk, I'd like to announce an upcoming event that's being organized by graduate fellows in ISSI's Center for Research on Social Change Graduate Fellows Program. And that talk will be also the second event in our ISSI Spring Speaker Series. That will be a talk entitled A New Movement Era.
He wants to stand over here.
I'm sorry, thanks. Sorry about that. Okay, the talk will be A New Movement Era Reflections by Francis Fox Piven. It'll feature Francis Fox Piven, who is a very well-known long-time researcher in this field, a distinguished professor of political science at CUNY Graduate Center. And it'll be moderated by Catherine Albiston, who is professor of law at Berkeley School of Law. That will be in 112 Worcester Hall from 4 to 5:30, and you're all welcome to come. It's on Wednesday, February 26th. Now, please, if you haven't already, turn off your cell phones. And also, there's a sign-in sheet going around. It's at the back. Please sign in on the sign-in sheet. So for today, Professor Raphael will speak for about 45 minutes, after which we will open things up for questions and comments. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Steve Raphael, who is Professor of Public Policy at the Goldman School of Public Policy, UC Berkeley. He has his PhD in economics, also from Berkeley, and he works on the economics of low-wage labor markets, housing, and for a while now, the economics of crime and corrections. And his most recent research is on the social consequences of the large increases in U.S. incarceration rates. And from that work, he's co-authored with Michael Stoll a new book, which was published by Russell Sage last year, and that will be the basis of the talk today. He works as well on immigration policy, on aspects of racial inequality, on the economics of labor unions, social insurance policies, homelessness, and low-income housing. He is the editor-in-chief of Industrial Relations and a research fellow at the University of Michigan National Poverty Center, the University of Chicago Crime Lab, and IZA Bonn, Germany. So please join me in welcoming Steve Raphael.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks for coming. It's wonderful to see so many people. Just a little background on this talk. For many years, I actually started out as a labor economist, and I started my research career studying racial inequality in labor market outcomes. And my colleague Michael Stoll and I, an issue that kept coming up as we were studying this topic was the fact that a lot of the men that we were studying in the low-wage labor market had criminal histories. And we presented all sorts of research on this topic. What do employers think about this? How does it impact the likelihood they get jobs? Does it impact recidivism and all these things? And I was presenting at a conference at NYU once, and a colleague, a friend of mine, said to me, well, you're always presenting these papers about criminals. Why are these people in prison in the first place? What put them there? Why do we see so much of this? And it was a good question I didn't have an answer for. And it sort of set me off on and Michael as well, on another research path, right? And the book that I'm going to present today is kind of the result, or sort of a summary of about probably 8 or 9 years of research on this topic that was sort of motivated by an offhand question by a very close colleague. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to try to answer this question that is posed on the screen, namely, why is it that we have so many people in the United States that are incarcerated on any given day? And I'll walk through, in a sort of a statistician's empiricist kind of way, what exactly are the forces that drove that, with a strong emphasis on the extent to which can we explain this by criminal behavior, or can we explain this by our policy choices? And then once we do that, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about a lot of the explanations that are commonly offered to try to understand our large prison system that really don't hold water. And so we'll look at issues having to do with mental illness, crack cocaine, the economy, and other things. And then finally, I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about what we know about the consequences of this change in terms of the benefits that it generates in terms of crime reduction. And this is actually quite contentious literature, but I think there's some pretty good research out there that we can use to sort of try to infer whether we get our money's worth along that particular dimension. It also is something that's very relevant to a lot of policy movement that's currently occurring in California. So hopefully we'll have some time and we can talk a little bit about some of the policy reforms in the state. So just to provide a little background, I'm going to have a few slides that just...
Could the light level in the room be lowered? The floor lights are really
there. Hey, there you go. So I'm going to start with just a few background slides. This is just a comparison of incarceration rates in the United States, in EU countries, and in some of our North American neighbors. And it's looking at everybody who's either in a prison or jail expressed per 100,000 residents. And what you can see is one bar is a lot higher than the other ones. So in the United States, our incarceration rate, when we have prison and jail together, is about 743 per 100,000. We dwarf all of the other countries that are in comparison. In fact, we dwarf every other country in the world. So we have perhaps the highest incarceration rate in the world when we look at both the pretrial population as well as the convicted population. And that's generally the way it's classified in other countries. What else is fascinating about this is that if we look at the time series trend in incarceration in the United States, we weren't always that out of sorts with what was happening in other developed countries. So what this picture is simply showing our prison incarceration rate from 1925 to 2010. And you can see that for these first 50 or so years, we had a relatively stable rate of around 110 per 100,000. It was right around 1975 when a famous criminologist, Al Bloomstein, right about here, wrote a paper arguing that the incarceration rate was some function of a natural law that just doesn't change that much. And then it just tough for 5 years. And everybody still teases him about this paper. Okay? And then, of course, just another characteristic of our incarceration rate is that it's not an equal opportunity risk, right? That it's very highly concentrated on specific people. In particular, men are way overly disproportionately represented among the incarcerated. And minority men, in particular, as well as men with relatively low levels of education. So all this is showing are two different series meant to convey that are tabulated as of 2001. It's actually the most recent effort to do that from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. The blue bars are just showing the proportion of men that have ever been to prison. You can see it's 2.2% among whites, 16.6% among African Americans, 7.7% among Hispanics. And the red bar is the Department of Justice's own projection of the lifetime likelihood of entering a state or federal prison for a child born in 2001. And you can see it's 6% for whites and 32% for African Americans, 70% for Hispanics. So it really is sort of an issue in terms of the impact on the lives of the poor and the lives of minority that is kind of a first order magnitude. It's pretty it's a pretty big deal. Okay, so hence the question, right? Why are we here? What happened over the last 30 or 40 years? What explains this incredible growth in incarceration, and what explains our sort of our position as the country that incarcerates the most people? So I always find as sort of a useful tool for thinking about the growth of a dynamic population to spend a little bit of time just thinking about what would determine a population where people flow into and out of an institution to change in size. And I like the analogy of like a university, right? That if we were to start a university and we admitted 1,000 freshmen this year, we'd have 1,000 students this year. Next year we'd have 2,000 because we'd have new freshmen and sophomore. Then we'd have 3,000 and 4,000. And then finally after year 4, we'd graduate 1,000, we'd admit 1,000, and we'd hit a steady state, right? Where essentially we'd have a population of 4,000. And we can use that simple model to think about what would alter the size of our university population. So we can think that the undergraduates aren't learning enough. We can add another year. Right? If we added another year, right, then we'd have 5,000 steady state. Or we can say we want to make more money, so we're going to admit 2,000 a year, right? And over time, that would lead to 8,000 in steady state. And as a general rule, anything that increases the rate at which we admit people, okay, or how long we keep people in that system is going to increase the size of that population. And the same thing goes for prisons. Anything that increases the rate at which we admit people to prison, okay, or anything that increases the length of time that people serve in prison are going to increase the proportion of the population they have incarcerated. So given what we saw in those basic statistics, that must be what happened. Either we're admitting more people, or we're keeping them there longer, and that must be explaining the trend. Now, of course, those two dimensions of variability can be driven either by increased criminality among the public, so we might be committing crime at a higher rate, Or it could be that crime isn't changing, but what's happening is we're punishing people more severely, right? So in the past, we would have sent them to prison for 2 years, now we send them for 4 years. Or in the past, maybe we sent 5% of these particular types of offenders to prison. Now we admit 20% of people in prison. And we can think of these different determinants in terms of whether they're behavioral, right, whether they're sort of reflecting a greater propensity to commit crime among Americans, or whether they're driven by policy changes, and in particular either more intense policing or change in our sentencing policy that is using prison both more intensively and more extensively. So what I want to do is spend a little bit of time kind of fleshing out what we know about that, and this is based on our analysis of various government data sources that are micro data records on prison admissions and prison releases from many states in the U.S. And this first picture is just showing essentially how the rate at which we're admitting people to prison per 100,000 compares in 1984 and 2009, and it breaks it down by the type of offense, sort of by the serious felony offense. That's the controlling offense that landed the person in a state prison. And basically what you see is if you look at the most serious offenses, murder, rape, robbery, you don't really see much of a change in the admissions rate, okay? And that doesn't actually, it's not too surprising because all these rates are actually lower. And for the most part, many of those people would have done time in the past in the same way that they do time now. But you do see increases in things like aggravated assault, right, where perhaps there's more room for prosecutorial discretion, for larceny, fraud, and then perhaps what stands out the most is the increase in admissions for drug offending from 9 per 100,000 to 47 per 100,000. So there's a very large increase in the rate at which we're incarcerating people for a drug offense. And then other offenses is just a kind of a catch-all for a bunch of relatively less serious felonies. This is another situation here where essentially when people are released from prison, they're on parole, which means they're still under the jurisdiction of the Department of Corrections, whatever state they're in, but it can be revoked quite easily. As the prison population has grown, we have more people on parole, and we're admitting more people per capita into prison from the status of parole, right? So that's basically what we see if we just look at overall admissions rates. Now, of course, we can take those admissions rate and we can decompose it into how much of that increase is driven by more crime, how much of that increase is driven by more arrests per crime, right? So sort of a greater ability for the police to actually clear the crime, and how much of it is driven by a higher likelihood of going to prison conditional on being arrested, right? So in other words, when we find someone guilty, we impose the sentence, are we more likely to send them to prison? So what this picture does is it simply takes for all of these different crimes, it shows the ratio of value in 2009 to the value in 1984. So if the value is greater than 1, it means that we've increased this quantity has increased. If it's less than 1, it means that it's decreased. The blue bars are showing our crime rates. And what you can see basically is that our 2009 crime rate relative to 1984 is much lower, okay, which is a sort of well-known fact among criminologists that crime is actually at historic lows in the United States. The red bar is showing arrests per crime, and for the most part it hovers around 1. So you don't really see a great increase in the rate at which the police are arresting people for these crimes. Although I'm not showing drug crimes here because it's hard to have a base level crime for drugs crime because it's victimless in the sense that there's no one calling in an offense. There is a big increase in arrests for drug crime, okay? But where we see really a huge increase is in the rate at which we admit people to prison for conditional on being arrested. And that goes up for every single one of these categories, right? So if you commit a felony today, the likelihood that you're going to do time is discretely higher, okay, by several times relative to what it is 20 or 30 years ago. So we just hit people with prison a lot more than we did in the past. And the important thing to keep in mind is in our minds, when we were sort of approaching this, we want to think of the blue line as behavioral in the sense is, does this reflect a particular severe crime problem in the United States? And the red and the green lines as policy, right? Are we policing more or are we sentencing people more? Because we're going to use that in the end to try to understand how much of it is policy and how much of it is a behavioral shift. Now, the other thing we can do is we can also look at time served, right? So there's a big difference between what your sentence is and what your time served is. In fact, in the past, sentences usually had a minimum sentence and a maximum sentences, and how much you actually served was determined by your behavior and a parole board and many different factors. But what we can do is we can say, well, sentence aside, how much time does the typical person spend in prison? It's sort of a difficult, complicated thing to estimate, but we did our very best to try to do it. And what you can see for the most part is that for the less serious felony offenses, you don't really get a very consistent picture of time served, at least for people who are admitted to state prison. But for the violent offenses of murder, negligent manslaughter, sexual assault, robbery, and aggravated assault, there are appreciable increases in time served, right? And it turns out that even though those categories are relatively small in terms of the number of admissions per year, the fact that they're admitted for so many years means that in the steady state they multiply into many more bodies behind bars. And it turns out to be an important contributor to prison growth.
So the offense is an offense that leads to prison. It's not necessarily a conviction, it's an offense that leads to prison.
Yeah, so all of these, well, in order you have to be convicted to go to prison, but all of these guys are people who have been convicted, are going to do time, and this is the amount of time they can expect to serve at these two different points in time. Okay. Just to sort of foreshadow one of the conclusions, one of the interesting things that we had found, despite the fact that there is such a huge increase in admissions for drug crime, and it is the case that if we think about the size of the population of former prisoners, that drug admissions are actually very important for determining the size of that former inmate population. When you look at what explains the difference between the United States today and the past, the United States in the present, or a high incarceration rate from a low incarceration rate, it turns out that it's the incarceration of violent offenders, right, that really explains the lion's share of growth in prison growth in the United States. And this is just a simple illustration of that. All this is doing is it's showing the distribution of incarceration rates in the United States across about 30 states, or 22 states, where the big blue line is what that looks like for violent crime, and then the other ones are for different offenses. And what you can see is that, really the biggest variety you see across states in the U.S. is for violent offending. And it turns out that that's a really, really, really important part of the story. Now, one of the things that I meant to mention but I forgot is in the U.S. we actually don't have one prison system. We have 51 prison systems, right? So we have one for every single state, and then we also have a federal prison system. So each state has its own penal code and violations that are prosecuted in state court and send people to state prison. But we have a federal prison where people who violate federal law are incarcerated. And there's sort of been a trend over the last 30 or 40 years whereby the federal or criminal law to a certain degree has become federalized, that the federal government has expanded its reach and is incarcerating people today that in the past would have been left to the states to deal with. The biggest expansion that we see in the federal system is in particular for drug offending, right? So what this picture is showing us is at three different points in time, 74, 89, and 2004, what the composition of the federal prison population looks like. And incidentally, the federal prison incarceration rate increased sevenfold over this time period. And what you see is that while it used to be about 28% drug offenders, in federal prisons now we have about 55% of the population that are doing time for drugs. And then we have actually relatively small proportions doing time for property and for violent crime, and a large increase in the proportion of people that are doing time for weapons offenses. And that's largely a result of the fact that if you're a felon and you're found in possession of a firearm, that's a violation of federal law, and you can get a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years. That local prosecutors have sort of turned to pushing into federal courts to seek the tougher sentence, as well as pushing the costs onto the federal government and out of the state. Okay, a couple other descriptive statistics about what happened in the federal system. Maybe I'll tell you what those say. Basically, also, if we look in the federal system, what we see is that the proportion of offenders that are referred to a U.S. attorney, the conviction rates have gone up discretely by about 12 percentage points. The likelihood that they're being sent to prison conditional on being convicted have gone up discretely, especially for drug offenders. And if we look at specifically drug offenders, you see a very large increase in the sentence handed down, right, on the order of 30 to 40 extra months, okay, which is nothing to sneeze at. And then when you combine that with the fact that the federal system has also greatly increase the minimum proportion of the sentence that they require offenders to serve. And so all of that in general is you see what you see in the state system, you kind of see it at the federal system. So in the book, one of the things that we did is we took all of these inputs and we said, let's work through a whole bunch of different simulations, or scenarios where we can say, what would happen if we returned our sentencing practices for drug offending back to what it was in 1984? What would that do to the federal or to the nation's incarceration rate? Or what would happen if we returned violent offending back or violent sentencing back to what it was in 1984? Using that model that I laid out where we can think about the rate at which people are going in and the rate at which people leave and so on and so forth. But holding constant crime rates or making adjustment for the fact that crime might be determined in part by what the incarceration rate is. And what we find is, number one, that you can basically explain almost all of the increase, in incarceration in the United States by changes in our sentencing practices. That almost none of it has anything to do with behavior or a higher propensity to offend. In fact, we tried to build into our simulations assumptions that will lead us to that conclusion, right? That is essentially a crime wave or whatever is the story you're going to tell that's explaining what happened to us, and it's just not there. Okay? The second conclusion that we came to is that when you look at the offending for specific offenses, that in the state system, offending for violent offenders is really, explains about half of the growth of what we've seen in growth in state prison populations. Drugs comes in second at about 22% of the growth, right? So it's sort of more that we send people who have murdered someone or have committed a sexual assault away for a really, 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 really long time. And that's essentially what's driving a lot of the growth. And then we have the secondary role of drug sentencing. In the federal system, the situation is reversed, right? Where you can explain almost, a big chunk of growth by the growth in federal sentencing practices, and in particular mandatory minimum sentences for people who've been convicted of drug crimes. While on the other hand, changes in offending for violent and property crime in the federal system are not really that important, really. It's almost all being driven by drug crime. The federal system is only 13% of our prison population, so it doesn't numerically account for a whole lot, but it is one of our largest prison systems. I think it is our largest prison population. And that's one where you can see federal sentencing policy with respect to drugs having a very big impact. Now, of course, this raises the question, this empirical analysis. What explains these changes? So what exactly are the sentencing policy specifics, that led to the growth that we documented in these changes in admissions rates and change in time served? So there are a number of things that happened. Again, it's very difficult since we have 51 systems to point to specific pieces of legislation and say that's the culprit. But there are what we like to characterize as sort of almost legislative sentencing fashions, that spread through the country kind of en masse. They start somewhere else, they're shared through professional associations, and they almost become the law of the land, but in this very decentralized, strange American way, right? For example, I do some work in Italy. Italy, everything is centralized, so you can identify laws very, very easily. In the United States, it's a little harder. But if we were to describe those fashions, you can describe a few different things. So the first of all, there was a shift in the 1970s from something that we call indeterminate sentencing to a practice that's referred to as determinate sentencing. Where indeterminate sentencing was the judge would basically you'd be convicted of a felon, you'd come up for your sentencing, you'd be given 1 year to 50 years, you'd go away, and then based on your ability to demonstrate rehabilitation or to please the parole board, however that may occur, they decide when to let you go, right? And most states, or a large number of states, abandoned indeterminate sentencing and moved to determinate sentencing, where you basically have a fixed sentence, right? And then not only do you have a fixed sentence, but oftentimes the role of the parole board is greatly diminished, and there'll be good time credits and other things that administratively determine how much time you're actually going to serve, right? So that's one of the changes that we see. Another of the changes that we see is that over, say, a 25-year period, all of the states pass a whole series of laws that we can classify as mandatory minimum laws that basically say if you're caught with this amount of drugs, you do this amount of time. And there's little discretion regarding, if you're convicted of this offense, what the judge can order. And it basically puts into the sort of sentencing structure this kind of very highly structured set of punishments that limits the discretion of criminal justice actors to sort of, modify, either through parole release decisions or through the discretion of a judge who might want to consider some extenuating circumstances in sentencing an offender. We also have a whole series of states that pass repeat offender laws. So, for example, in California, we have a notorious 3 strikes law that is particularly severe, where, for any second strike, any second felony strike following a first felony strike, your sentence is doubled. If you have 2 strikes that fit into a rubric of potential strikeable offenses, the 3rd strike gives you any felony, right? Gives you a sentence of 25 years to life. California isn't the first to do that. Okay, there's actually one in Texas before us, but we were one of the early pioneers, and a lot of states have these repeat offender laws that sort of became very popular in the early 90s and basically led to a ballooning of our prison population. And then finally, just one more example, in the sort of mid-90s or the early 90s to mid-90s, almost every single state either passed or strengthened a practice referred to as truth in sentencing policy. And the basic idea behind truth in sentencing is simply, if someone is sentenced for 10 years, they have to serve at least 10 years or 85%. There's some minimum sentence, and it's meant to sort of create a lot of certainty that the person is going to serve the amount of time that they are meant to serve. And in fact, this sort of adoption and sort of increased stringency of truth in sentencing was to a certain degree incentivized by federal policy that basically provided subsidies under the Clinton administration, the 1994 Violent Crime and Control Act, to build prisons. Okay, so there were sort of capital construction subsidies for prison building for states that adopted truth in sentencing laws for violent offenders that mandated that violent offenders serve at least 85% of their sentences. So that passed. These are all policies that basically not only increase the likelihood we send people to prison, but also increase the amount of time they serve. Now, of course, we can peel that layer off the onion and we'd say, well, why did all this happen, right? Why didn't it happen in the 1960s? Why didn't it happen in the 1950s? And there's, competing claims about what was important and what was not important. So, for example, if you read Vesla Weaver, right, the political scientist at Yale, she's written extensively about the sort of a rise of truth or of law and order language to try to sort of recharacterize the actions of the civil rights movement and to recast it as sort of a criminal action rather than a civil disobedience action. And she argues ahead of time that this is all sort of a political strategy to kind of take something that is a hot button issue and it's easy to get the electorate excited about and turn it into something that one can compete on electorally, right? Essentially be tough on crime. And once you go down that road, right, it's sort of an asymmetric political competition in the sense that it's very easy to be tough on crime. It's very hard to say, let's think about what we're doing, right? Because you go out on that limb and then somebody saws off your limb and you're not in office anymore, right? So that's sort of one story. Another story that comes up probably, say, from the right side of the spectrum would be sort of embodied in a very famous book by James Q. Wilson that was published in the early 70s, where he made the argument that the U.S. Sentencing system and criminal justice system was basically easy on criminals, right? And there really wasn't much of a connection between one's actions and punishment. We'd send people to prison for a long time and they'd be out a year later, and to the detriment of everybody in non-institutional society who's obeying the law. In part, the sort of analysis there, it's actually very interesting, has kind of its genesis in a lot of the thinking pioneered by Gary Becker in terms of a rational offender, right? That if we can just make the costs of doing time or the cost of committing a crime here and the benefits here, that we can deter a lot of crime, and so we'd have very stiff sentencing. But one would also argue that if you're sympathetic to this line of reasoning, that if we look in the 60s and 70s at crime rates leading up to the writing of Wilson's book, that homicide rates are actually increasing quite sharply. Crime rates are increasing, but nobody really knows whether it's a real increase in crime rate because there's some suspicion that part of it reflects better reporting under the UCR system. But there's this general sense at this time period, right about the time that Al Bloomstein is writing his article, that the prison population is almost like equals MC squared, right? There was a sense that essentially crime was out of control, whether it was for political reasons or racial animosity or actual fear of crime is something that is still debated. Okay, so that's what we're going to say about that. So now let's move on to a couple of factors that we look at that are meant to sort of address the issue of what doesn't explain incarceration growth. So there are a lot of things that are offered to explain what essentially happened or why the prison population grew up so much. One is that we deinstitutionalized a lot of people from mental hospitals over the latter half of the 20th century. So what this picture is showing, the red line, the mental hospital inpatients per 100,000, or the purple line, is showing the number of people we have in mental hospitals from about 1930 to 2000, expressed as a rate per 100,000. You can see around 1950 it dropped sharply. The green line, or the blue line, is showing the prison population, which is what we've already looked at earlier in the talk. And then the green line is showing the combined groups. It's like the total institutionalization rate. And there's a very prominent op-ed piece in the New York Times about 5 years ago by a Chicago law professor who presented this up and said, we're not really doing anything different. We're just housing the same people in different places. And the whole rise of the U.S. incarceration rate is really, sort of an illusion, right? Rather than being mental hospitals, people are in prison. It turns out when you look closely at this thesis, you can show quite easily that it just doesn't hold water. Okay, and one of the main reasons is that these are two largely different populations. There's some overlap, but they don't overlap that much. So, for example, if we just, I'm sorry, the numbers are kind of small, so hopefully you can see them. If not, I'll point them out. The first two rows, the first two columns of numbers are showing descriptive characteristics for the population of mental hospitals in 1950 and the population in prisons and jails in 1950. This is something that you can actually observe in the U.S. Census and estimate characteristics of the population. What you see, first of all, is that if we look at the mental hospital population in 1990, the mental hospital population is relatively old. Right, so you have fully 20% that's 65 years or older, 18% that's 56 to 64, and we can compare that to who's in prison and jails. They don't quite look the same, right? So you have an issue where a lot of who was in mental hospitals were people that were sort of up in the age distribution. Okay, in terms of the racial and ethnic composition, African Americans were not overrepresented, or slightly overrepresented in the mental hospital population, but you don't see like a heavily overrepresentation that we do in the state prisons. And most interestingly, almost half of the population of mental hospitals in 1950 are female. Okay, and we know that when we look at prisons and jails today, they're over 90% male in every state of the country. Right, so there's just this sort of mismatch between these two groups. Now, of course, the way deinstitutionalization proceeded was the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. We saw basically, with the passage of the Medicare Act, there was movement of people, especially elderly people, out of mental hospital institutions into nursing care. We had some pharmacological innovations that allowed people with severe mental illness to not live in institutions. And there was a pretty large drawdown. In fact, if we look at this graph, most of the decline is happening before 1980. Before most of the prison population, before the prison population starts to take off. So we can just see that in the timing. First of all, the population being deinstitutionalized at the beginning of the decade, or at the beginning of this process, does not look like who ends up in prison 30 years later, and the timing is wrong. So it's 30 years earlier. And in fact, one of the things that we've spent a lot of time doing is trying to estimate for very precise demographic groups the proportionate change in mental hospitalization rates and see if there's any corresponding correlation with changes in prison institutionalization rates for the period 50 to 80, and there's essentially no relationship. You can't find an effect. Okay. Now, of course, we can fast forward to the period from 1980 to 2000, because most of the population growth in the U.S. prisons is occurring during those last 2 decades. And one can ask, well, perhaps it was that last bit of deinstitutionalization, that last 100,000 or so people that were really driving up the prison population. They're going to be more severely mentally ill, perhaps more at higher risk of ending up in the criminal justice system. And so we might want to analyze that area separately. But even there, you can put a pretty solid upper bound, and you can say that this can't be a particularly important explanation. So, for example, what this is doing is it's looking for white men, and the little blue bars are the mental hospital institutionalization rates per 100,000 for people of different age ranges. The red bars are the changes in institutionalization rate over the next 2 decades, right, that are being driven by growth in the prison population. And you can see that at most, if we emptied the mental hospitals in 1980, this is the upper bound of the growth in institutionalization, right? And you can see that those bars are just much smaller than the growth that we see in incarceration. Well, and it's just to kind of see 1,049, 1,073, 1,339. You can look for African American men, okay, where the growth is really huge, right? So, for example, black men between 31 and 35, the institutionalization rate goes up by 8,776 per 100,000. And compare that to the base rates of their presence in mental hospitals, and you can just see that numerically it can't be a very important contribution, right? In fact, we do quite a bit of analysis, and we can find that at least for white men, there seems to be a strong relationship between deinstitutionalization and growth in prison population. So there is some transfer from one group to, or there's no physical transfer, but the reduction in the mental hospital population has increased the prison population somewhat, but it's not a primary explanation of what happened. Okay. Now, there's a couple other things we can look at, right? So what has happened to the country's demographics, okay, since the 1980s? We've become more educated, we're older, and we've become more immigrant, okay? And all three things tend to sort of lead to lower incarceration rates. And there are a couple of different ways you can show that. So one of the things that we did is we took, the year 1980, and we looked at men, and we defined a whole bunch of groups defined by their age and their education and their race and their immigration status, and we ranked them all from the lowest incarceration rates to the highest incarceration rates, and then plotted what's called a cumulative distribution function. So, and what that means is, so for example, I know I'm getting on it, sorry about this, but this, right, if we were to follow this up here, this says that, 30% of the incarcerated population, or 30% of the population is in groups 60 or less, right, where groups are ranked according to their propensity to be incarcerated. And what you can see is basically that the whole distribution in terms of our propensity to be incarcerated has shifted to the left, right, that we are now, at least among men, populating cells that are less likely to be in trouble according to the 1980 incarceration rate. So our demographics are bucking the prison trend. And there's another way to show that, right? We can ask, for example, we have an institutionalization rate in 1980. We could say, what would happen to the institutionalization rate in 1980 if the demographics changed as they did for the next 30 years, but our institutionalization rate stayed the same? And you can say within each graph that basically if our institutionalization rates remained at what they were in 80, but our demographics changed the way they were, our incarceration rates would have declined today. Okay? Or another way of saying that is if we look at our proportion incarcerated today and return our demographics to what they were in 1980, our incarceration rate would be a lot higher, right? So you can't explain much in terms of that. Now, another thing that we spent a lot of time thinking about is what is the role of the crack epidemic. So for those of you that study crime, one of the things that comes up quite often is this idea that there was this sort of negative innovation in the market for illicit drugs, which is the crack epidemic during the 1980s. There was a lot of violence surrounding the crack epidemic, a lot of extra crime surrounding the crack epidemic. That generated a lot of admissions to prisons, long sentence to prisons, and that's what caused the ballooning of our prison population. So we tried to take this hypothesis seriously, and what we did is the following. We took all of the states, and the one crime that is most associated with the crack epidemic was the rise in black male homicide rates. And we basically took all 50 states and we dated the onset of the crack epidemic by finding the point where the black male homicide rate spiked. And essentially aligned all the states on an axis around their date when the crack epidemic spiked. And that tended to happen around 1987 to 1991. And that's this blue line. So you can look at the black male homicide rates and then bam, right? So you can actually see the effect of the crack epidemic. And then what we did is we said, well, let's look at what the prison incarceration rate was doing before and after this change. And for the most part, by the time we got to the onset of the crack epidemic, the incarceration rate had already doubled, right? So we were already well on our way to seeing the growth that we saw. And there's a slight increase in trend afterwards, but it's not that great, right? So even if you just project our path forward, it explains most of what happened. And then as the crack epidemic wanes, our prison population still grows, right? We're not the first to point this out. Okay, there's a pretty well-known paper by Stephen Levitt and Roland Fryer that does something very similar. They actually create their own index of the severity of the crack cocaine epidemic, and they can't find really much of a relationship between the changes in crime associated with the crack epidemic and admissions to prison. Doesn't make, and that's again not too surprising. Okay, largely because the contribution of crack to crime, while the contribution of crack to lethal crime is quite severe, so overall crime is not as big as many people think it is. Now, of course, one might make the argument that the contribution of crack to prison growth indirectly could be quite serious, right? Because there was quite a bit of hysteria surrounding the crack epidemic in the mid to late 1980s that led to very draconian changes in sentencing policy. Okay, so the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity for crack versus powder cocaine was the direct result of federal legislation passed in 1986 and 1988 meant to punish people for crack cocaine, largely because there was this fear that somehow crack cocaine was more serious, more severe, more delusionally, creating more violence than other drugs. And so we can say that there's this indirect effect via expectation. And it is interesting at the time, so if for those of you into this sort of thing, later on Google, anti-drug commercial with snake dealer, right? There's sort of this great, it's not a great commercial, but there's this commercial that was on all the time when I was a kid in the 80s that shows a drug dealer talking to a young kid and he literally turns into a snake in front of his eyes. He's a crack dealer, his tongue is sticking out and everything like that. So it was this, literally just a hysteria over crack during the 1980s, and it had a profound influence on sentencing policy, and also on expectations and beliefs about what was driving things. Okay. Okay, so that's now. I wanted to spend just a little bit of time, so I know I'm almost out of time, right? On talking about the relationship between incarceration and crime. So, we've had this very large increase in crime. Very large increase in prison population. It's cost a lot of money, right? We spend roughly $80 billion a year. It's generated a huge wake of ex-offenders or former prisoners in society, with a whole bunch of collateral social consequences associated with that. On the benefit side, right, there are those who argue that coinciding with this very large increase in prison is a very large reduction in crime rates in the United States. And so there are some who might make the utilitarian argument, right, that essentially one of the benefits we get from this policy is that we have much lower crime as a result. So one of the things that we close the book with is we try to have a discussion of this relationship between incarceration and crime and what does the evidence show. Now, and what I'm going to do is, we can think of all of the different avenues that connect incarceration and crime. So, you have a threat and punishment. Some people might be deterred from committing crime that they otherwise wouldn't if in the absence of that punishment. So there's a story that we threaten with prison, and as a result we have less crime via general deterrence. Of course, we remove people from society. If those people have a high propensity to offend, physically removing them from society is going to suppress crime because they can't commit crime, right? Because they're behind bars. They can commit crime behind bars, but those aren't going to be measured in the FBI uniform crime reports, right? So that would lower our crime rate. There's specific deterrence, which is the idea that the experience of doing time will alter your crime profile in the future because you don't want to go back to prison again. But then, of course, we can have something called the criminogenic effect of serving time in prison, which is you go to prison, you learn to be a better criminal, you're brutalized by other inmates and by the system and by guards, and you come out more criminally prone, right? And you can even imagine in steady state that if you have people cycling in and out of prison, as we do in the United States, and as we especially do in California, that we might have fewer people in society, but people with a higher likelihood of committing crime and even higher crime rates as a result. So there's all this debate about what's going to happen. Now, of course, there's research on this issue. And what the research seems to suggest is that, at least as far as prison is concerned, that effect 1, 3, and 4 are relatively small, but the incapacitation effect of putting somebody away can be relatively large. That being said, the incapacitation effect tends to exhibit very strong diminishing returns to scale, right? In the sense that it's very big when our incarceration rate is very low, but it can be very small when our incarceration rate is high. So just to show you a little bit from 2 case studies that I've worked on. So 2006 Italy passes a law on July 1st that basically reduces the sentences of a whole bunch of their felons in prison by 3 years, and it leads to an immediate release of about 25,000 inmates. Okay? And there's a long, interesting story behind this, and a long, odd history in Italy of every now and then doing this to sort of empty the prisons for various strange reasons. In this instance, it was actually due to overcrowding and actually a concerted effort by Pope John Paul to sort of advocate for prisoners. But it led to a very large reduction in the prison population. So this is basically showing the Italian prison population monthly. This is where we get to August 1st, 2006, drops by a third and goes up. And we can look from there at what happens to crime. And not surprisingly, we have crime rates, the prison population goes down, crime rates go up, and then as the prison population returns back to where it was before, crime starts to go down, right? And we can use this to estimate, like on an annual basis, how many felony crimes are being prevented by these guys being behind bars. And it depends on whether we use the variation in this break or the variation along this adjustment path. Okay, but if we do it, we get relatively large numbers, right? That can be anywhere from you're preventing 18 felony crimes per year for each year served by one of these guys, for if we just use the break, or as much as 47 crimes per year if we look at the first guys that are sent back, the ones that mess up the quickest, right? For the most part, in Italy, right, the reducing the prison population this way generated a lot of crime and generated a lot of additional crime per inmate. Now, that being said, if we look at the Italian incarceration rate, what we see is that the rate is very low, right? It's about 100 per 100,000, and that's their jail and prison population combined. It's really 1/7, right, of our prison population in the U.S. So now let's fast forward to California, where we have something very similar happen, but for different reasons. So I'm not going to go over this history. But there were a couple of cases filed by inmates against the state, one claiming that the state was providing inadequate health care, one claiming the state was providing inadequate health care, and the state was placed under federal receivership, where basically a three-judge panel or three-judge federal court ordered the state to reduce its prison population to 137.5% of capacity. It was at 200% of capacity. And what the state did, starting in October 2011, is they basically sort of reduced the prison population by A, making it very hard to send people back to prison for a technical parole violation and sort of only threatening them with punishment in a local jail, and B, diverting people who are committed of relatively low-level felons to local jail, where they're generally serving relatively short sentences. And we can see what happens to the state's prison population. So this is actually weekly admissions to a CDCR, to a state prison in California, before and after this law goes into effect, right? This is off, okay, but that should happen that should happen. Oh, no, it's right. It happens on October 1st is where you see this very, very, very big drop in admissions. And if we look at the state's prison population, this is basically what we see, right? That we were at over about 160,000, and then over a relatively short period, our prison population dropped to around 130,000, right? So there was a reduction of 28 to 30,000 inmates driven by this reform. Now, on a per capita basis, this is actually larger than what happened in Italy. The one difference is about a third of these guys are sitting in county jail, but there's been a very large increase, right? As we're speaking, okay, over the last year and a half or so, in the number of people who were in a California prison who are now basically in non-institutionalized society. And one could ask, well, what happened to crime? So what this picture is doing is it's showing California's violent crime rates. So this is murder, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault, and it's found a set of comparison states that, through a statistical algorithm, very closely match what California's crime rate looks like before we had these realignment reforms. This 2012 and in part 2011, our crime rates were essentially, we're in this new world where people are out there with us, and you can't really find any statistically significant difference between California's violent crime rate and the violent crime rate in these comparison states. If we look at property crime, you can see a little bit of an effect, right? So after we sort of reduced our prison population, there does appear to be an increase in property crime, and I'll characterize the size of that in a minute, okay? We can look at it differently across California counties, and this is one of the most fascinating things, that in California the counties vary from San Francisco that has an incarceration rate of 200 per 100,000, Europe for all intents and purposes, and then Kings County that has an incarceration rate of 1,200 per 100,000, right? There's that big a difference across the counties. And not surprisingly, it correlates with things like the proportion of voters that support limiting the death penalty, and it's the proportion of voters that vote Republican, and all those sorts of things. To a certain degree, it reflects the ideology of the local county. Well, not surprisingly, those counties that had lots of people in prison, when they were forced to not send back low-level guys, had a very large reduction in their prison population, and those counties who didn't send that many didn't have a large reduction. So what this picture is showing is just looking at a bunch of before-after comparisons, before-after the change went into effect for the 58 counties over several months, and how that correlates with changes in crime. So for violent crime, it's flat, right? Even if you look across counties, you can't really find any evidence that this big reduction in the prison population impact violent crime. While for property crime, there's a slight negative. Line. Okay, and what do those point estimates suggest? Well, we can estimate what the effect of each inmate released from a state prison has on crime rates over the course of the year. For violent, the blue lines are our estimates, and then the black things are our confidence intervals around those estimates. For all of the violent crimes, we can't find anything. For burglary and larceny, we can't find anything. The only thing we can find is for motor vehicle theft, right? So we do find an impact on motor vehicle theft, and it's on the order of 1.2 incidents per 100,000, right? So we have 1.2 incidents here in California, where we have a large reduction. In Italy, we had an impact that was 18 to 46 incidents per 100,000. So why is this occurring? Well, we have a much higher incarceration rate. When we expand the incarceration rate, to go back to what I said at the very beginning, we're either keeping people there longer, and when we keep people there longer, they're usually older, and older people don't commit a lot of crime, right? Because they can't run that fast, right? So I'm getting older, and I can't commit as much crime as I used to, right? So that's one issue, right? That when we expand the use of prison along the extensive margin, it's not that cost effective because it means you're incarcerating people into advanced age when they're generally speaking much less criminally prone than they used to be. But then on top of things, we're expanding incarceration along the extensive margin. So there's people in the past that we punish with incarceration that we wouldn't have punished with, or today that we wouldn't have punished in the past. And they tend to be less severe criminals than the people that would have been the marginal offender, say, in 1984. And then not surprisingly, what we see is that we have a very large reduction in the prison population. We don't have a huge increase in crime. The sky did not fall, right? In fact, if we look at the U.S. at California's incarceration rate, coupled with the transfer of people into jail, our incarceration rate is right about where it was in 96, 97. Okay, so we've gone almost all the way back to before 3 strikes. A big reduction in the incarceration rate, but our crime rates are still very low. Right, they're roughly half what they were during those years, despite this very large reduction. Okay, which is and then of course we can think about maybe there are different things about California than Italy. There'd be institutional differences and so on and so forth. Criminogenic differences between Italy and California might explain this. However, taking these two case studies aside, there's actually ample empirical research by economists and criminologists that suggests that currently the marginal effect of putting someone away is very small, right? And in fact, there's almost this rising political consensus where you have people on the right like Newt Gingrich and Grover Norquist and Jeb Bush that are advocating for shrinking the prison population because they think it's a waste of money and it's doing a lot of social harm. And then you have people on the left who've been screaming that since the very beginning, right? So it is sort of an odd little policy window at the moment where there's probably room for rethinking the way we do our corrections. Okay, so what now, right? So we can ask the question, being an economist, I can't get out of here without doing a benefit cost calculation. So, on net, can we say that the high incarceration rates in the U.S., do they outweigh the benefits, and do the costs outweigh the benefits in terms of crime prevention? I think if we were to, abolish prisons and let everybody out, that'd probably be a bad idea. Okay, but that's not the same thing as saying we could reduce prison by a lot, right? I think actually, if we look at the relationship between incarceration and crime, and many of the innovations for controlling offending behavior among highly criminally prone people, there are alternatives, right? And we can probably reduce our incarceration rate by half, right, and probably not appreciably impact crime in the United States. Are there alternatives to high incarceration? Yes, there are. There are several, right? So, for example, the most obvious, and it's probably the least popular to say in a room, is that if you hire more police, right, a lot of times that actually has a very strong crime suppressive effect, largely through deterrence and extra patrolling. And that is, in my book, okay, sort of an improvement over having a low policing, high incarceration rate. I'd rather have more police and fewer people in prison. I think it's less socially costful and probably less budgetarily impactful as well. I actually, think if we wanted to turn things around in the United States, we spent a lot of time thinking about why the incarceration rate grew so much. Our conclusion was driven entirely by policy. Largely because, our crime rate is much lower than it was in the past, okay, and we can identify very specific policies that have driven incarceration growth. If we wanted to reduce the incarceration rate, I think it's just that we have to reduce policy, right? We have to essentially change the way we sentence people. We have to change our sentence practice. We have to be more sparing and judicious in depriving people of their personal liberty as punishment, right? So there's a very famous judge in Hawaii who's innovated, who has sort of kind of a star in criminal justice circles for a relatively innovative program for managing probationers, who likes to say, we should incarcerate people who are a threat, not incarcerate people who are mad at. And I think that, generally speaking, that's a great idea. The one thing that we also point out in the book, and we spend a lot of time talking about, and it's something I think that has become increasingly more salient as a result of what's happened in California, is that we think that counties should face some marginal cost associated with sending someone to prison. Okay, that essentially what happens in this country now is somebody offends, they're tried in court by essentially county employees, the district attorney, and then they're sort of heard by a judge, and then the person is sent off to the state. And who pays the bill when you send someone off to the state? The county doesn't pay the bill, right? The state pays the bill. And I think that the fact that there's this sort of fiscal federalist structure creates a very strong incentive to sort of overuse the prison system. And there are lots of small little inklings about how important this can be. So, for example, in the mid-1990s, California introduced a per head charge for admissions to the California Youth Authority, where they used to have to pay $25 per kid per month, and then it went from anywhere to 50% to 100% of the cost, which could run over $100,000 for kids who are not serious offenders. Not surprisingly, admissions to youth authorities fell through the floor. So all those people who had to be admitted to a state institution before no longer had to be admitted. That's because the counties faced marginal costs, right? Or alternatively, in California and other states, there are efforts to share the cost savings with counties, right? So, for example, you might look at a county and say 20% of your probationers are violated each year, and you send them to prison. If you get that down to 15%, we'll figure out how many fewer people are in prison as a result. You get a part of that money, we get a part of that money, and everybody's happy, right? Those programs work. Right, so people actually, or counties admit fewer people to prison when they face they find other ways to deal with their population of felony offenders other than using prison. They become more sparing. So I think aside from sentencing reform, getting the incentives right at the different levels of local government could probably lead to a much more efficient and less wasteful use of corrections resources and probably result in a lot less social harm. Yes, that's probably enough. I think I went over my time. I'm sorry, Jay.
You certainly used your time to good effect, and I'm sure that there's a whole bunch of questions, and you're very experienced. So why don't you just handle the crowd?
Yeah, you began your analysis showing racial disparities and the significance of that, and then suggested a partial explanation based on race. And then the last two-thirds of the presentation, race dropped out. And I wonder to what extent you think, if you traced race on through, to what extent you think many of these policies, that is, you've convinced me that it's many and varied explanations for the increase and decrease in this. But to what extent is this a covert racial set of racial policies?
I'll ask you a question. So, it is the case. I mean, I did show a little bit of that if we look at the growth in the incarcerated BA in 2000, the growth is many times for African American males what it is for white males. To a certain degree, that is going to be the direct result of a disparate impact of sentencing, of tougher sentencing. So you can almost think mathematically that if you're going to send offenders to prison at a higher rate, and that's convicted offenders, people who end up in the system, and you're going to keep them there longer, and there's a difference in baseline, there's already a racial disparity, then that racial disparity will magnify, right? And it's relatively easy. So that's part of what's happening. So, you can get to the differential growth without there being, an attempt to sort of target African Americans. All you need is a base level disparity in the rate at which African Americans in the criminal justice system. I think the harder question is whether we sort of publicly support these changes, whether we vote for the initiative that tacks on an extra 5 years for this, or a stiff 3 strikes law, because we're envisioning an offender that is African American and male, right? And I think there are many people who would argue, yes, that's precisely what happens. That's, Michelle Alexander sees this as sort of an attempt to control low-skilled African American males, just Louis Coupon as does many people. It's very hard to come up with an empirically testable explanation or an empirically testable prediction from that story, but it's consistent with the evidence. That being said, right, there are others, for example, as we were talking about James Q. Wilson arguing that crime was on the rise and we're not punishing people effectively. Another thing that happened at the time is there was a very famous review, meta-analysis published by Mortensen at the time that argued that nothing works in rehabilitation. And, not only did Mortensen write this review that argued that nothing works, but he actually, went around the country and in very public forum, it was Martinson. That Martinson argued in very public forum, right, that essentially, rehabilitative programs don't have an impact on recidivism. And there was a shift in mood, right? And it could be that this was not essentially an attempt to control one group of society relative to another, but it simply reflects exasperation with our criminal justice system. Both consistent with the data, right?
On that score, at the beginning of your talk, you showed the greatest increase in incidents of drugs, parole violations, and others. Michelle Alexander talks to the parole violation in terms of her description of the fact that people who get out of prison don't have any social support, and they wind up having to depend on an underground economy, and they get violated. What those 3 categories, however, essentially contain within them is another category that you don't deal with and that would problematize the whole category of crime, and that is the victimless crime laws, where nobody gets hurt, but they get arrested for drugs or weapons or others. Now, what makes that a really important factor in the increase in prison population is police policy. Not simply the policies of sentencing, but police policy of search, of stop and frisk, of racial profiling. And racial profiling has resulted in a prison population in which black people have 9-to-1 chance of incarceration over white. I can make an argument that the prison population today, 70% of them are there for victimless crimes.
That's not true.
However,
it's not true.
There's one victimless crime that is contained in that, which is, I think, very important, and that is resisting arrest. Resisting arrest is a crime for which there is no victim, but it's included in violent crime statistics. That is a direct result of the change of police policies. And so I would like to ask you on what basis or how you reconcile the fact that, there is this tremendous account of changes of police policy that filled prisons, as the essential policy changes, which you don't deal with.
It's not that we don't do, we actually do spend a lot of time trying to figure out how much changes in parole violation rates contribute to prison. And again, there's a mechanical reason why that parole failure rate doesn't lead to large increases in prison. Not everywhere. In California actually turned out to be very important because we had a really wacky parole system. But in most states, when you go back for a parole violation, if it's not with a new term, you're going to go for a relatively short period of time, right? So say you go back 6 months on a parole violation, okay? And let's say if you go for 6 months versus 20 years for murder, okay, it will take 40 parolees to have this, or 40 parole violations to have the same effect on the steady state incarceration rate as one admitted murderer, right? And it's because the length of time that they're in prison is so much longer, and they accumulate and they stay there for a long time. So for example, if we look at the prison population is about half there for violent offenses. And it's not for resisting arrest, it's for murder, it's for rape, it's for aggravated assault where there's serious bodily injury to the person. So there's a lot of people who have done things, okay, that are very serious crimes. It's not 80%.
I get that from your statistics, but that's okay.
Well, it's there. It's there. So, I would say that the arrest behavior, yes, okay, so we do arrest a lot of people. We admit a lot of people to prison for short spells for drugs, and it generates a lot of former inmates. But if we're trying to understand the growth and the numbers and why we have so many people there, the real money, so to speak, metaphorically, is in the people that we send away for a long time. It just turns out to numerically be true. Uh-huh.
In the deinstitutionalization question, how did you control for the nature of the criminals being let out of prison? Let's take in California, for example, if the typical prisoner let out was a thief, a target, as opposed to a violent criminal, then obviously the effect on the violent crime rates after the deinstitutionalization is not going to be very great. So how did you control for what the balance was of those criminals let out of prison in terms of its impact on the crime rates?
Well, that's a good question, and I think not to invoke a technical term, but one could say that the average treatment effect of any given decline is going to depend on how the policy has changed. So, for example, in the Italian case, not only did they start from a much lower base incarceration rate, but it was a very broad release. They basically said, anybody with 3 years left on your sentence or less, with the exception of people involved in the mafia, were let go, right? And then a couple other crime categories. So it led very large reduction in a pretty highly criminogenic population because they used prison sparingly. In California, no one was actually let out early. What California did, California had this unusual system that every year prior to this reform, we admit about 120,000 people to prison. Something like 75-80% were people going back for parole violations who hadn't technically committed another crime. They hadn't been convicted of a new crime. So most of the reduction in California just basically stopped that practice. So rather than letting people go, we just stopped admitting people for missing an appointment, for having a dirty drug test, or for whatever reason the parole agent thought to arrest the person, drop them off at the prison door, or the local prosecutor diverted the person to a board of parole hearings and sent them back to prison. And that alone, right? So it wasn't that we're taking people who've committed serious felonies and not sending them. We're just basically not sending back parolees. And then the low-level guys that are committing low-level felonies who don't have a history of violence are being sent to local jails. So we would expect there to be a smaller effect. First of all, because we had we had way more to work with, right? We have a much higher incarceration rate. And then secondly, the way the reform was structured, it was to try to, not send people back who haven't committed a new felony. And then lo and behold, we didn't really have much of a reduction. We were at least to date. So, by the end of 2013, that's 15 months into the reform, there has been no measurable increase in most crimes with the exception
of
of
would you argue that the deinstitutionalization should go deeper then into the prison population, or pretty much deal with those types of criminals that have parole violation, that sort of thing? In other words, what if we went deeper into the nature of the prison population for release?
Well, this is, actually kind of the situation that the state faces because we didn't meet the target, and we're short 6,000 or 7,000 people, and the 3-judge panel gave the state a couple years to figure out what to do, and as unseemly and politically unseemly as this is, when you talk to a prison warden, if you ask who would you let out with an eye on, public safety, they'd say, well, probably anybody over 45 who was convicted of murder who's done 20 years, right? So they're looking at people who have committed very serious violent crimes, who have desisted, who are well-behaved behind bars, and have a long time to serve, right? And in essence, we probably could, think about those inmates, right, that essentially have relatively low recidivism rates when they're released, but are politically more difficult to release because they've oftentimes committed very serious crimes, and you encounter the most resistance to releasing them from prison. And I think that's where, and that of course with elderly and infirm inmates, and, there's lots of places one could look.
To bring in another aspect of the economics of this, one of the things prison provides is 3 hops and a cot. It is, in fact, a place to get board and food and a lot of other very unpleasant things. And one of the consequences of releasing lots of people who are, in many cases, unemployable for a variety of reasons, at least in the near term, in a state where the level of social welfare provision for such folks is at a very minimal level, is that you might expect higher levels of property crime on a sort of almost a survival basis. And I'm not trying to be naive here, but people have to eat. So when you're talking about the county incentives, are the counties or the state acknowledging that as a plausible theory, a plausible model that might in fact validly describe the behavior of at least some people and trying to address it?
I don't know if there are any law enforcement people. Law enforcement people have a different orientation to a certain degree. Like I think in probation departments, probation officers tend to have more of a social work orientation, and they do think like that. I think a lot of law enforcement does think like that, but their primary objective is to maintain order and public safety, and so they're more concerned with clamping down on bad behavior and finding the person that didn't show up 3 days within 3 days of release and serving that warrant and bringing them back.
Even at the top levels, that mentality prevails?
It depends, So, for example, the powers that be in San Francisco are very progressive, from the district attorney's office all the way across the board and all the agencies. I think in other counties that's not necessarily the case, right? There's a lot of anxiety around realignment, and there's a desire to just reincarcerate, put as many of them in the county jail as possible, and to perhaps undo the law, although there hasn't been that much resistance to what's happened. There was at first. I mean, the one thing about this reform is there's quite a transfer of resources to the counties to address the population, and the counties vary in how they're doing it. Some counties are relying on heavy use of the local jails, and other counties are trying to invest more in services and rehabilitative efforts for their newfound population. But yeah, of course, people understand that the population people released from prison, they're poor people, right? And they have to eat like anybody else, and they need services and housing and medical care and oftentimes mental health care. So there's sort of a lot of problems in this population.
So you've got a lot of options for the changes in the policies that led to the incarceration. So one of them that stands out for me is the 3 strikes law. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's the perfect way to structure it, right? It has the incentives are there, the deterrence is there, and you're taking out of the population the frequent offenders, right? So on a cost-effective basis, that might be the right way to structure laws.
Yeah, one could say, right? So in essence, that is the Becker model of deterrence, right? That essentially if you had severe enough penalties that people would be deterred and not offend in the first place, and then the people who are just incorrigible would be picked out and permanently incapacitated.
Right, so you're just testing them, right? We give you 1 try, it doesn't work, we give you 2, it doesn't work, we give you 3.
Right.
And we put you away. Any way to test whether 3 strikes is an effective strategy in terms of reducing crime?
Well, there is, I was just teaching this paper to my class the other day. There is a very interesting, there's one very convincing study about deterrence among second and third strikers. And what you can see is that if you look at the likelihood of rearrest among people released from prison with 2 strikes compared to the likelihood of rearrest with somebody who was released from prison with 1 strike, but their last offense was for a 2nd strike, but they copped down to something lower, the rearrest rate for the guys 2 strikes is discreetly lower than the rearrest for the other. And that's because the guy with 2 strikes faces life if they get into trouble again. The guy with 1 strike and a half, so to speak, doesn't, right? They face a sentence enhancement. That being said, even those guys with 2 strikes are rearrested at the rate of like 48% or something. I mean, it's really, really, really very high.
Yeah, but we also want to put those guys away, right? I mean, maybe, right?
Well,
maybe in terms of
it depends. It depends. So 3 strikes means different things in different states. In California, the list of things that can accrue a strike it's pretty broad. It includes very serious things, but can also include like a home burglary or something like that. And once you have that strike, the sentence enhancements kick in for any felony offense. So there's famous case of someone that stole $100 from a sporting goods store, got 25 to life, right? Or someone who stole 3 slices of pizza and got 25 to life because they had 2 priors, and the 2 priors weren't necessarily violent crimes, right? In some instances there are. But you can talk to defense attorneys anywhere in the state, and everyone has an example of somebody who was doing 25 to life, whose jacket, so to speak, is not as serious as you would think, given the severity of the sentence. And in fact, the state, we passed an initiative to stop doing that, to kind of soften 3 strikes. So one could make the argument, that it could be efficient to do this, right? But when you completely remove discretion, right, it can also lead to a lot of years of incarceration where you're not preventing that much crime, right?
I'm going to take the opportunity to thank Steve, and then we can continue with more conversations afterwards. But I just want to say thank you for a very packed and